I'm Madelynn Warfle, and we're going to be talking about Greek sculpture today. So first, we're going to talk about materials. The most common materials used in Greek sculpture were limestone, terracotta, marble, and bronze, with marble and bronze being the most popular as they were the easiest to form and very durable. It also helped that in the territories of ancient Greece, there was an abundant supply of fine marbles and the ores for bronze making, so they were relatively easy to obtain, so that definitely helped. Limestone, for the most part, was used exclusively in the Archaic period because Greek stone sculpture developed from woodworking, and the soft varieties of limestone could be easily carved similarly to wood, using the same techniques and the same techniques and the same tools. However, limestone didn't have quite the same surface finish as marble, and it couldn't take as much detail. So that's why marble became more popular, as it was also more widely available. So the terracotta process is actually similar to that of bronze working, but it wasn't as popular. It was less honorable, and obviously the terracotta afterwards was a lot more fragile than the strong metal that bronze was. And actually, because of the scrap value that bronze has, very few original bronze sculptures have survived. However, many copies of the Roman period are just marble versions of works that were made originally in bronze. So moving on to the pre-Hellenic period. So this wasn't actually strictly a classification of Greek sculpture. It was just a time period that they needed a name for, and it spanned all the way from the Stone Age to the decay of the Bronze Age. And the term pre-Hellenic just means like when the inhabitants in the area that we think of as Greece weren't actually considered to be Greek. So historically not considered to be Greeks. This period encompasses also Neolithic and Cycladic figures, as well as both the Minoan and Mycenaean culture. So a lot of examples of sculpture from this time were small votive sculptures, specifically in bronze and terracotta, that were just used for, funeral purposes. So they were used in domestic shrines and rural sanctuaries of the Minoans and Mycenaeans. The only really monumental work of this time is the Great Lion Gate at Mycenae. And this relief sits atop giant massive stones that make up the citadel's main gate. So this is carved out of limestone, and as you can see here, there are two symmetrical lion figures. Feline figures, they don't know for sure if they're lions or, griffins or some other type of animal. And so they have their paws up here on this hourglass-shaped altar that it's holding up this tapered column. And so this gate actually was meant to be both functional as well as decorative. And the imagery was meant to be apotropaic, or have the power to turn back unseen threats. So the gate was there to, protect them from tangible dangers, whereas the imagery was protecting them from evil. So moving on to the early Iron Age, this was also known as the Dark Age, and it refers to the time period that came about after the fall of the Mycenaeans, but before, the real rise of the polis. So artifacts from this time are mostly pottery, and while they're not entirely imageless, they do reflect sort of a lack of interest in representing any identifiable objects, especially the human figure during this time. So the Lefkandi on Eviva has become famous after this centaur figurine here, made out of terracotta, was found there. And so this small votive statuary that was popular in the Bronze Age never really died out, but this specific centaur stands out because of its larger size, its nice quality, and its subject. So archaeologists have discovered that the body was actually wheel thrown, while the limbs, torso, and head were molded separately and attached later. They can also see that there are ventilation holes, and this indicates that the figure was actually fired. So the forms are fairly simplified and the details at a minimum, but there are joints in the legs, separate fingers, and as you can see, distinct facial features such as the large ears. And this discovery means that Greek mythology started influencing art a lot sooner than historians had thought before. Because this is a centaur, they're abundant in Greek mythology, and so it's very interesting that this early on there were sculptures of them. That brings us to the geometric period, and geometric is actually a term that was coined in the 1870s by Alexander Conze, and it is described as both analytical and generic, and it does favor, certain shapes and abstraction. Artists would use these kind of simplified forms to portray only the essential aspects of their subject matter. And so this geometric style was seen mostly in pottery, but in some figurines as well, as you can see here. An example of a geometric figure is this bronze sculpture that was actually found in Olympia of a man and a centaur. And it's interesting how this piece does a good job of articulating both the human and equine form. Their forms are simplified, but you can tell the difference between the two, which is very interesting. Next comes the Daedalic time period. So geometric eventually develops and evolves into what is called Daedalic, and this style is named after the legendary figure Daedalus, whose name means skilled craftsman. So Daedalic statues are usually strongly frontal, like the one you can see here, that have sort of a two-dimensional aspect. There's not a lot of, there's nothing dynamic happening. And so other hallmarks of this style are triangular heads, rhomboid torsos, and circular earlobes. And in 1907, a limestone statue of a female figure was found in the French town of Auxerre, which is why she's been named a Lady of Auxerre. She's believed to be originally from Crete, and she's unusually well preserved. Her dress is heavily decorated with a polychrome scale pattern on her tunic, and her skirt features a lot of geometric elements. And so this heavy decoration is believed to have divine and or ritual associations. Next comes the Archaic period, and the Greeks were inspired by the large stone sculptures of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, and so they once again began carving in stone. The archaic style deviated from the previous ones by more so focusing on the human figure. More than ever before, there was an increasingly accurate comprehension of human anatomy, where the musculature and the skeletal structure were actually visible. And the figures that prevailed during this time period were called the choros, or the standing nude male youth, and the chor, the standing draped girl. Also really popular at this time was what historians call the archaic smile, and this refers to the expression that was most prevalently used on works during this time. And the thing about this expression is that it seems to have no specific appropriateness to the person or situation that is actually depicted in the sculptures. And historians believe that this may have been used to give the figures sort of a distinctly human characteristic. So an example of archaic sculpture is the Pepulus core, as you can see here, which is made of marble, and it was found on the Acropolis of Athens. And pepulos is the heavy woolen type of robe or shawl, the shawl-like fabric that the girl is wearing, and the figure is described as being stiff and taut, and it, as you can see, it does feature that sort of archaic smile that they're talking about. So another interesting thing about this piece is that traces of the original paint still remain. And sort of newer studies of this piece have found that her robe, or the peplos, was actually decorated with animals, which definitely suggests that she isn't just any ordinary girl, but perhaps this was an image of a goddess like Artemis. Which brings us to talking about polychromy. And so polychromy is the art of painting in several colors. And a lot of people actually don't know that ancient Greek sculptures were originally painted in really bright colors. We think of them as, white and kind of monochromatic, and that's because over time the original pigments have deteriorated. So some of the really well-preserved statues still show traces of their original color, and archaeologists can now reconstruct what they would have originally looked like. And as you can see here, an example of this is an attic gravestone of a youth and his sister, and kind of the top portion here is this sphinx. And after the colors were restored by an archaeologist, it was found that the sphinx at the top wasn't chromatic like this, like, it appears, but actually had a rich and vibrant palette of red, black, and blue, kind of looking more like this. So next up is the severe style, and this is also referred to as early classical. So now that archaic smile is completely gone and has been replaced with the sober, sort of abstracted or downcast expression, prominently featuring heavy-lidded eyes. And the hair on these types of sculptures was usually represented by a mass of simple wavy lines on the head. So the Temple of Zeus at Olympia is full of examples of this style, specifically Hercules fighting the Cretan bull, as you can see here, with his broad and powerful torso, kind of square-like torso, and his figure is kind of diagonally crossing with the bull's figure to make the bull appear larger as he takes up the entire metope. And he does have a fairly sober and somber expression looking down at the bull. And this is it's interesting that in this time period, these like action and heroic scenes, they specifically chose this after he was already kind of at the end, like he has the bull and is going to win. So after the severe style or early classical, we get into full-on classical. So this time comes after the archaic, but before the Hellenic, and a dramatic change in both the style and function of sculpture happened during this time. During this time, Greek sculptors have become more and more skilled, especially in depicting the human form. The poses became more naturalistic, and a counterpose was used for the first time. Another hallmark of this style were the small rosebud lips that can be seen on many classical pieces. And as far as function goes, there was a large increase in sculpture being used to decorate buildings and becoming really an integral part of the architecture. So the statue of Athena at Parthenos is considered to be one of the greatest classical sculptures, but unfortunately it has been lost. It was moved and destroyed. But a lot of smaller copies and other materials do still exist. And one of the most faithful reproductions is the Vervakian Athena, as you can see here. And this is made of marble, and it actually has traces of red and yellow paint. But this is what they believe to be the most similar to the large one that used to be in the Parthenos. And so now we're going to jump into a couple more examples of classical sculpture, starting with the Discobolus, which also means disc thrower. So this was sculpted by sort of a famous Greek sculptor, Myron, and it is one of the most iconic and well-known ones of this time. As with a lot of these, the original was in bronze, and it was copied in marble several times. This was actually, Discobolus was on the official poster for the 1948 London Olympics. So that just shows you like the lasting effect and how iconic this sculpture is. So this it features kind of smooth facial features with an impassive expression. And the pose is described as both distorted and elaborate. They say that you would never actually throw a disc like this, but it kind of was an artistic choice to make it so elaborate. And it also is a great example of rhythmos, or kind of a harmony and balance that the piece has about it. And I will say it's interesting that the figure is muscular and powerful, like the Hercules we just looked at, but he's definitely more slender. And so the next classical example we're going to look at is both Diadomenos and Dorophoros. And so that means diadem bearer and spear bearer. And these are famous sculptures by Polykleitos, a famous sculptor. And again, they were originally in bronze, but they were recreated in marble. And they're both representations of young male athletes, and convincingly naturalistic poses. They're both standing counterpose with their weight on their right foot and their left knee slightly bent, and their expressions are really self-contained, almost if lost in thought. And so this one over here is the diadem bearer, and he would be holding a diadem, which is kind of a banner that was used after winning. And over here, the spear bearer would usually, be holding a spear, but he isn't anymore. So next up in our examples, is the Armesian bronze. And so he got that name because he was found off the Cape of Armesian. And it's actually nicknamed God from the Sea because of that. And so the sculptor is unknown from this piece because they, found it in the middle of the ocean, and there's no indication of who the artist could be. But the statue is believed to be either Zeus or Poseidon. So if it were Zeus, he would be holding a lightning bolt, and if it were Poseidon, he would be holding a trident. And these empty eye sockets here were originally most likely inset with bone, and the eyebrows were inset with silver, and the nipples were inset with gold. And so the special thing about this pose, with sort of like the deep extension of his arms, and how he's sort of resting on his left heel, and his right toe, kind of makes this one leg profile, where this leg is more of a frontal view out towards us, and this really suggests more of a three-dimensionality, and this is kind of what grew out of the classical period that we weren't seeing before. And we can't finish up on the classical period without talking about drapery. It's known for drapery during this period, especially on the female body, as Greek sculpture did not present females in the nude until after the 4th century BC. So there was actually little regard to how fabric would actually realistically hang on the body. And so classical sculptors used modeling lines, cantileries, motion lines, and illusionary transparency. So these modeling lines are used to emphasize bodily contours. So kind of how it curves around her leg or around her arm. And the cantileries are used to create chains or like bunches of fold, how it's like bunching up over her leg here. Motion lines were used to indicate stretched or flying material, so kind of how it's like flowing out behind her here. And then illusionary transparency, kind of made the fabric adhere to the wearer, so like how it's really, hugging her chest and hugging her legs. And so this is a Nike adjusting her sandal, and this is a great example of drapery, and because of all the things I just said. And the Cantary folds really add like a grace and a stability to her, which would otherwise be a really awkward pose. Okay, and so moving on to the Hellenistic period that followed the classical. The dictionary definition of Hellenistic is following Greek modes of thought or life. And so this transition from the classical to the Hellenistic saw increasingly more diverse art. This era saw even more of an increase into naturalism. And so common people of all ages, all kinds, were now considered to be acceptable subjects when they weren't before. There was no longer as much of an emphasis on these ideals of beauty or physical perfection. There was also an increase in the size of sculptures, and the facial expressions became more powerful and seemed to have more energy. And like these sculptures would still have very classical themes, but their treatment would be far more sensuous and emotional. So now we're going to look at more examples of Hellenistic sculpture. So first up, we have Laocoon and his sons. And this is another really famous ancient sculpture, and it's considered to be one of the best examples of sort of this Hellenistic Baroque, this Hellenistic Baroque style. And the three figures, Laocoon in the middle here was actually a Trojan priest, and these are his two sons on the side, and they're all being attacked by sea serpents, and they're actually nearly life-size. They're quite large. And so this sculpture was excavated in Rome in 1506, and ever since then, it's just considered to be one of the best sculptures. Sort of how the contorted expressions of the face and the straining of the bodies, like every part of Laocoon's body is strained, is kind of the epitome and really fully expresses like human agony and suffering. And so the kind of backstory of Laocoon is actually that he he's a priest, Trojan priest, and he actually tried to stop the Trojans from, bringing the Trojan horse in, and the goddess Athena didn't like that very much because she wanted the Trojans to do that and win. So this is her punishing him by sending the sea serpents after him, and so that's why it really shows like the wrath of the gods and just the human suffering and agony. And then next up is another, right here is another really famous example. I'm sure you've heard of this before, Venus de Milo, from the Hellenistic period. It's on display at the Louvre, and it was sent there after being discovered on the island of Milos in 1820. So this figure is made of marble, and it depicts either, they thought at first that it was for sure the goddess of love, Aphrodite. As you can see here, by Venus is the Roman name for Aphrodite. But now they think it could also be the sea goddess, Amphitrite, which is actually Poseidon's wife. So they're not entirely sure who it is, but it has been nicknamed Venus de Milo. And so this statue is actually slightly larger than life size, and as you can see, it's missing both of its arms. And kind of an interesting thing, they haven't found the arms, but they also can't see any sort of mechanism as how the arms would actually be attached. So that's kind of an interesting fact. And she is half clothed, with her bare torso, and she's greatly admired for her proportions and her pose, how she's sort of like relaxed on one foot, and the drapery around her, and her like individual expression. She doesn't she looks kind of aloof and mysterious, which is what like has really drawn people to appreciate her. So another really iconic, famous one, I'm sure you've seen this one before also, is the winged victory of Samothrace. And it's also called the Nike of Samothrace because this is a depiction of the goddess Nike, the Greek goddess of victory, and that what the brand Nike is named after. So victory, athletics makes sense. And so the sculpture of this is unknown, um, but this is actually, and so this is only one of like a really small number of major Hellenistic statues that is the original rather than a Roman copy. The right wing is the only thing that's not original. It was added with plaster by mirroring the left wing. And so this statue definitely conveys a sense of action and triumph, as well as the, artfully throwing drapery. And this work is definitely notable for showcasing kind of that moment where like violent motion and sort of that sudden stillness meet. But it also has like a graceful balance to it. So it's very interesting, very dynamic. And another thing I thought was cool was the pattern of the feathers on the wings is said to not resemble any of a bird's wings in nature and no other wings that are represented in Greek art. So it's very unique. And so I also wanted to just take a moment, excuse me, and talk about kind of comparing Greek sculpture to modern sculpture. Because there are both a lot of similarities and a lot of differences. A lot of people will say, historians and archaeologists will say that the Greeks kind of carved their souls into the marble that they used, and they really expressed their ideas um, rather than actions, and that modern art just doesn't measure up. It doesn't come close to the, artistry and technique and the meaning behind Greek art. But I will say it is kind of interesting when you put this like geometric ancient Greek sculpture of this bronze horse here compared to this modern, also bronze sculpture of a horse by Deborah Butterfield. They both, are abstract. Um, they both are, horse, like they're only using the necessary elements to convey that it's a horse, but not anything else. And when you look at them side by side like this, they really don't seem to be that drastically different. So I can definitely appreciate, the beauty and the emotion behind Greek art. But I do think it's interesting that, even modern sculpture is influenced and takes after Greek sculpture as well. So these are my works cited here, and that's it. Thanks for watching.